Last Christmas, my sister looked at my 9-year-old son in the middle of a full family dinner and said, "If you can walk, prove it." Then my nephew dragged my son's wheelchair across the room while everyone watched. My son reached for it and grabbed nothing but air. No one moved. No one said a word. So I pulled out my phone and called the one person who could end the lie right there at the table, his neurologist. What happened next destroyed the silence in that room, and a few weeks later, my grandfather changed his will and cut my sister out of it completely. My name is Alara Quinn, and this is the night my family learned the difference between mocking a sick child and paying the price for it. Chapter 1. Christmas dinner at my parents' house had always been loud in the comfortable way families can be loud when they believe nothing truly bad will happen at the table. Laughter, overlapping laughter, chairs scraping across hardwood floors, the smell of roasted ham and cinnamon drifting through the hallway from the kitchen. That night in December of 2022 looked exactly like every other Christmas we had celebrated in that house in Columbus, Ohio. At least, at first. I arrived a little earlier than the others because my son Rowan moves slower when he's tired, and I hate feeling rushed with him. Snow had been falling all afternoon, and the sidewalks outside my parents' place were thin sheets of ice. I parked at the curb, stepped out first, and walked around to the passenger side to open Rowan's door. He was already watching the house through the frosted window. "You ready, buddy?" I asked. He gave me a small shrug that 9-year-olds give when they want to seem braver than they feel. "Yeah." Rowan Quinn, 9 years old, 4th grade at Lakewood Elementary. Thin brown hair that never stayed flat no matter how much water he ran through it. From the outside, he looked like any other kid, until he tried to stand too long. I unfolded the wheelchair from the trunk and set it on the sidewalk. Rowan hated the chair, but he understood why it came with us everywhere. His condition makes his blood pressure drop when he stands too long. Some days he can walk across a room just fine. Other days, he'll get dizzy after a minute and suddenly the floor is closer than it should be. So the chair travels with us, not because he always needs it, but because when he does, there isn't time to argue with gravity. Rowan slid out of the car and steadied himself with one hand on the door. "You good?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "I'll walk in. I'm okay." He always says that first. I pushed the wheelchair behind him up the front steps. My dad opened the door before we even knocked, the way he always does. "There you are," he said, reaching out a hand to steady Rowan as he stepped over the threshold. Inside the house, everything smelled like clothes and pine. My mom, Darlene Vale, had the table set with her best dishes, the ones we weren't allowed to touch when I was kids. Rowan sat in the dining chair closest to the window. I parked the wheelchair beside him, angled so he could grab the armrest if he needed it. Mom noticed immediately. Her eyes flicked to the chair, and then to me. "Is that going to stay right there?" she asked. "It's where Rowan can reach it." She didn't argue, but she adjusted the silverware at the place setting across from him like the chair had somehow disrupted the symmetry of the table. Rowan leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm okay, Mom." "I know you are, but okay doesn't always mean safe." My dad disappeared into the kitchen to finish carving the ham. For a few minutes, the house settled into the normal rhythm of a holiday evening. Then the front door opened again, and the temperature in the room changed. "Marina!" My younger sister walked in first, brushing snow from the shoulders of her coat like she had just stepped off a magazine cover instead of out of the Ohio winter. Marina Vale was 36, a real estate agent who always managed to look like she had somewhere more important to be. Behind her came her kids. Leela, 14, already holding her phone like it was attached to her hand, and Noah, 12, who ran ahead in socks across the hardwood floor until he slid to a stop beside the dining table. His eyes landed on Rowan, then on the wheelchair. "Oh," he said, snickering, "the chair's here." Marina followed his gaze. Her eyes paused on the wheels for a second longer than they needed to. Then she smiled the way people do when they're pretending something is funny instead of uncomfortable. "So we brought the chair again," she said lightly. Rowan shrank a little in his seat. I saw it happen, even though he tried not to show it. He tugged at my sleeve. "I'm okay, Mom." I squeezed his shoulder. "I know." Dinner started not long after that. My dad carried the ham in like he was presenting a trophy. Plates passed around the table, forks clinked against china, everyone talking over one another about work, school, traffic, the usual noise of family. But Marina kept glancing at Rowan. "You know," she said at one point, leaning back in her chair, "he looks pretty healthy to me." I didn't respond. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Marina only made her louder. Across the table, Rowan focused very hard on cutting his food into tiny pieces. Leela stood up suddenly. "Hold on," she said, already raising her phone. "We need a picture before we start eating everything." Mom loved that idea immediately. "Yes, everyone stand over here by the tree." Chairs scraped across the floor as people moved into position. My dad wiped his hands on a towel and joined them. Rowan stayed seated. Leela frowned at the screen of her phone. "Wait, Rowan, come stand over here." He shook his head gently. "I can't stand that long." Marina set her fork down. "Can't," she repeated. Her voice carried across the room. Rowan shifted in his chair. "I just can't stand very long." "You were walking in just fine earlier," Marina said. I felt Rowan's muscles tense under my hand. He started to push himself up, the way he sometimes does when he thinks making other people comfortable matters more than making himself safe. I put my hand firmly on his shoulder. "No." He looked up at me, relief and embarrassment fighting across his face. That's when Noah moved. He slipped behind Rowan, where the wheelchair sat waiting like a silent backup plan. "If you can stand," Noah said, laughing a little, "you don't need this thing." Before anyone could react, he grabbed the handles and pulled. The wheelchair rolled backwards across the hardwood floor until it bumped against the sideboard. Rowan's hand shot out instinctively toward where it had been. His fingers closed around empty air. For a second, he just stared at the space beside him. Then his breathing got shallow. "Stand up," Noah said, still laughing. "See? Easy fix." No one moved. That's the part that still sits heavy in my chest when I think about that night. Not Noah pulling the chair. Kids copy what they see. What hurt was the silence. My mother watching the tablecloth. My father frozen halfway between standing and pretending everything was still fine. Marina standing there with her arms folded, expression curious, like she was waiting to see what would happen next. Rowan looked small in that chair. Smaller than 9 years old should look. I stood up slowly, not fast, not angry, just deliberate. I walked around the table, took my phone from my pocket and unlocked it. Marina tilted her head. "What are you doing?" I tapped one contact. The phone began to ring. Rowan looked at me confused. "Mom." "You don't have to say anything," I told him softly. Across the room, Noah had already stopped smiling. Marina frowned. "Who are you calling?" The screen lit up as the call connected. I turned the phone so everyone at the table could see it. "I think," I said calmly, "it's time everyone here talked to Rowan's doctor." And the small spinning icon on the screen paused, right before the video feed began to load.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 2. The illness no one wanted to believe. The screen flickered once, the little circle turning slowly as the connection tried to catch a signal through the winter storm outside. While everyone in that dining room stared at the phone in my hand, my mind slipped backward through the years without asking permission. Because none of what was happening that night had started at Christmas. It had started long before that. The first time Rowan told me the room was spinning, he was 5 years old. It was the summer of 2018, and we were at a playground 2 blocks from our apartment in Columbus. He had been climbing the small ladder to the slide when he suddenly stopped halfway up and sat down. I remember walking over thinking he had scraped his knee. Instead, he looked up at me and said quietly that the sky was moving. At first, I laughed gently and brushed his hair out of his eyes. Sometimes kids say strange things when they're tired. "You probably stood up too fast," I told him. "Drink some water." He nodded like he believed me, and after a few minutes he seemed fine again. The next time it happens, we were in the grocery store. Rowan was standing beside the cart while I compared 2 boxes of cereal, and suddenly he grabbed his side of the cart like the floor had tilted. "Mom," he whispered, "everything's spinning again." I crouched down and asked if he had eaten breakfast. He had. Maybe he was dehydrated. Maybe he needed more sleep. Maybe it was nothing. That's the thing about the beginning of a problem. You want it to be small. For months, the moments came and went. Rowan would pause in the middle of a game or lean against a wall longer than other kids did. Then he would bounce right back and keep playing like nothing had happened. Most of the time, he looked perfectly healthy. That made it easy to explain away. Until it wasn't. In the fall of 2020, Rowan was in 2nd grade at Lakewood Elementary School. One morning, his teacher called me while I was at work. Her voice sounded calm in the careful way people speak when they are trying not to scare you. Rowan had collapsed in the hallway. He hadn't hit his head, but the school nurse wanted him checked out just to be safe. I left my office at Midwest Freight Solutions and drove to the school with my heart beating so hard it felt like it might break something inside my chest. Rowan was sitting on a narrow cot in the nurse's office when I arrived. His skin looked pale, almost gray, and he kept blinking like the fluorescent lights were too bright. "Mom," he said quietly when he saw me, "I got dizzy again." That afternoon, we ended up at the emergency room. The doctors ran a handful of basic tests and sent us home with instructions to follow up with a specialist. Over the next several months, Rowan went through more appointments than any 8-year-old should have to sit through. Blood work, heart monitoring, neurological exams, long conversations where he had to describe what it felt like when his body suddenly forgot how to stay upright. That was when we met Dr. Celeste Rowan. She was a neurologist at a clinic on the north side of Columbus, and the first thing I noticed about her was that she spoke directly to Rowan instead of around him. "Tell me what happens right before you feel dizzy," she asked. Rowan thought about it carefully. "Sometimes my legs feel weird first, like they're not really there." She nodded slowly. "And does it get worse when you stand up for a while?" "Yeah." After several visits and more tests than I could count, Dr. Celeste finally sat with me in a small office and explains what she believed was happening. Rowan's autonomic nervous system wasn't regulating blood flow the way it should. When he stood too long, his blood pressure dropped and his body struggled to keep up. It meant he could have good days and bad days. Some mornings he might run across the yard with no problem. Other days he could feel faint after standing in line for 5 minutes. The hardest part, she told me gently, wasn't the diagnosis itself. It was what came with it. People misunderstand conditions like this all the time. She folded her hands on the desk. When a child has one good day, everyone remembers that day. They forget the 10 days that came before it. I knew exactly what she meant, because Rowan had already started noticing it too. At first, he refused to use the wheelchair Dr. Celeste suggested for longer outings. "I don't want one," he said the first time we talked about it. "Why not?" He stared at the carpet for a long moment. "People will think I'm weak." "You're not weak." "I know, but they'll think it." So we compromised. The wheelchair would come with us, but Rowan would decide when he needed it. Most of the time, he tried not to. One afternoon the following spring, I picked him up from school and noticed the way he climbed slowly into the passenger seat. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded too quickly. Later that night, I found out what really happened. Rowan had tried to walk across the playground during recess, even though he felt dizzy. He didn't want the other kids asking questions about the chair. By the time he got home, he was so exhausted he fell asleep on the couch before dinner. When he woke up a few hours later, he looked embarrassed. "I just wanted to look normal," he told me quietly. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he said, because it meant my 9-year-old had already started measuring himself against what other people expected his body to do. Not everyone in our family understood that. In fact, one person had started questioning it almost immediately. Marina. My younger sister had always been good at turning curiosity into doubt. The first time she said something openly was during a family barbecue in the summer of 2021. Rowan had managed to walk from the patio to the kitchen without needing the chair. Marina watched him all the time. Then she leaned toward me and said under her breath that if the kid can walk like that, he probably doesn't need a wheelchair. I remember the exact way Rowan looked up when he heard that. Not angry, just confused, as if he had suddenly realized that the adults around him weren't looking at the same truth. After that day, I scheduled another appointment with Dr. Celeste. I wanted to be absolutely certain we weren't missing something. She reviewed Rowan's tests again and repeated what she had already told us. His condition hadn't changed. What had changed was the number of people offering opinions about it. Before we left that appointment, she walked us to the door and paused. "If anyone ever pressures Rowan to prove he's sick enough, call me." She said it casually, but her eyes stayed serious. Kids with invisible conditions get put on the spot more than you'd think. I nodded, not really believing that moment would come. Most families don't stage medical interrogations at holiday dinners. But as the phone in my hands finished connecting that winter night in my parents' dining room, Dr. Celeste's voice from 2 years earlier echoed in my memory. And I realized she had understood something I hadn't wanted to imagine. Because the moment my sister's son dragged Rowan's wheelchair away from him, I already knew what to do. When someone forces a child to prove their illness, you make them talk to the person who understands it better than anyone else.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 3. The Room Goes Silent. The screen cleared and a familiar face appeared under the pale glow of the phone. Dr. Celeste Rowan adjusted her glasses slightly, the soft light of what looked like a living room lamp behind her. It took half a second for the camera to settle, and in that half second, every person at the table leaned forward without meaning to. The doctor looked straight through the phone screen. Her expression changed the moment she saw Rowan. "Rowan, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Rowan lifted his eyes slowly toward the phone. His fingers were still gripping the edge of the dining chair. "Yeah." His voice was small but steady. Dr. Celeste leaned a little closer to the camera. "Are you safe right now?" Rowan hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The room felt different already. Conversations had stopped completely. Even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen had gone silent. Marina was the first person to recover enough to speak. She stepped closer to the table and looked down at the phone like she was inspecting it. "Sorry," she said, forcing a polite smile. "Who exactly are you?" Dr. Celeste looked up at her. "I'm Dr. Celeste Rowan." She said it calmly, like she said it 100 times a day. "I'm Rowan Quinn's neurologist." The shift in the room was immediate. My father slowly set the carving knife down on the counter behind him. My mother's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Lila lowered her phone without realizing she had stopped recording. Dr. Celeste looked back toward Rowan again. "What happened?" Rowan glanced briefly toward the sideboard where the wheelchair was now too far away for him to reach. Before he could answer, I spoke. "His wheelchair was pulled away from him." The words sounded louder than I intended. Noah shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The smirk he had been wearing a minute ago had disappeared. Marina gave a short laugh. "Oh my God, we were joking." Her voice carried that sharp brightness she used when she was trying to turn something serious into a punchline. "It was a joke. Kids mess around." Dr. Celeste didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Instead, she looked directly at the camera as if she were studying the entire room through the tiny lens. "Where is the wheelchair right now?" I pointed toward the sideboard. "About 6 feet away." There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Dr. Celeste spoke again. "That chair is a medical aid." Her tone was steady but firm. "Taking it away from him is not a joke." Marina crossed her arms. "But he can walk." The words came out fast, almost defensively. "I've seen him do it." Dr. Celeste nodded once. Yes, he can. That answer surprised Marina. She leaned forward slightly. Exactly. But the doctor continued before Marina could say anything else. Rowan can walk short distances on good days. That doesn't mean his condition disappears. Her voice stayed calm. It means his body is unpredictable. No one spoke. The silence began to press against the walls of the room. Dr. Celeste shifted her attention again. Rowan, did you try to reach the chair when it was moved? Rowan nodded. I thought I was going to fall. My chest tightened, hearing him say it out loud. The doctor looked back toward the camera. If Rowan falls because he doesn't have access to his wheelchair, the situation changes from a family conversation to a medical emergency. The words landed heavier than anything that had been said all evening. Marina opened her mouth again. You're making this sound dramatic. Dr. Celeste shook her head gently. No. She paused, letting the words sit there. I'm explaining the risk. Behind me, my father exhaled slowly, the sound almost like a sigh. My mother stared at the tablecloth like she had suddenly forgotten where she was. Across the room, Lila slowly lowered her phone all the way to her side. Noah was the first person to move. Without saying anything, he walked to the sideboard and grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. The wheels rolled softly across the floor as he pushed it back toward Rowan. He stopped beside the chair and stepped away. Rowan reached out and placed his hand on the armrest. The relief on his face was small but unmistakable. Dr. Celeste watched the movement carefully. Thank you, she said simply. Then she looked back into the camera again. There's something important everyone in that room needs to understand. Marina shifted her weight again, visibly uncomfortable now. Rowan's condition doesn't look dramatic most of the time. Dr. Celeste continued. That's what makes it difficult for people who don't understand it. She folded her hands together in front of her. A child with a visible injury receives sympathy immediately. She let the next words come slowly. A child with an invisible condition often receives suspicion instead. No one argued, not even Marina. The doctor glanced toward Rowan again. This boy is not pretending to be sick. Her voice softened slightly. He's trying to live a normal life while managing a body that doesn't always cooperate. Rowan stared at the floor, but his shoulders relaxed a little. Dr. Celeste leaned closer to the camera. And when he pushes himself to walk on a good day, it's not proof he's fine. She paused. It's proof he's trying. My throat tightened, because that was exactly what Rowan had been doing for years. Trying. Trying not to look weak. Trying not to make anyone uncomfortable. Trying not to be the reason a room went quiet. Across the table, Marina shifted again, clearly searching for something to say that would bring the conversation back under her control. This is getting blown way out of proportion. Her voice sounded thinner now. Dr. Celeste didn't respond immediately. Instead, she asked one simple question. Did someone move his wheelchair? No one answered. The silence itself became the answer. The doctor nodded once. Then that needs to be understood for what it was. Her gaze stayed steady. A mistake that could have caused real harm. Noah looked down at his feet. My father rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. My mother finally lifted her glass and took a small sip of wine. But Marina remained standing with her arms crossed, her confidence slowly draining out of the room like air from a punctured balloon. Rowan squeezed my hand under the table. I realized then that the tension in the room had shifted completely. A few minutes earlier, everyone was watching him. Now they were all watching Marina. Dr. Celeste's voice softened again. Rowan. He looked up. You did nothing wrong. He nodded once. For a moment, no one spoke. Then I exhaled slowly and reached over to end the call. Thank you, I told the doctor quietly. Of course, she said. Call me if you need anything. The screen went dark. The room stayed silent. No one rushed to fill the space with small talk. No one pretended the moment hadn't happened. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Rowan looked at me immediately. We're going home, I said gently. He slid his hand into mine. My father took a step forward. Ilara. I looked at him. He hesitated, clearly unsure what he was about to say. Then he stopped. I didn't wait for anything else. I helped Rowan into his jacket, folded the wheelchair, and walked toward the front door. Behind us, the dining room remained completely still, and for the first time all night, no one tried to stop us.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 4. When the Story Changed. The next morning, the house was quiet in that strange way mornings after a storm often are. Rowan sat on the living room floor building something complicated out of small plastic blocks, his wheelchair folded neatly beside the couch, where we always kept it when he wasn't using it. The sunlight coming through the window made the snow outside look almost peaceful, like the night before had never happened. But the silence didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while I poured coffee. The screen lit up with a message from my cousin who lived 2 states away. I almost ignored it. Holiday group chats had a way of exploding after family gatherings, and I didn't feel like reliving the previous night. But something about the message preview made me pause. Your sister says you embarrassed everyone. I stared at the words for a long moment before opening the full thread. It didn't take long to understand what had happened. Marina had already begun telling her version of the story. In that version, I had dramatically called a doctor during Christmas dinner to humiliate the family. In that version, Rowan's wheelchair had been nothing more than a prop I used to get attention. In that version, the entire scene had been blown out of proportion by me. By noon, 3 different relatives had sent some variation of the same message. One of them asked if Rowan was really as sick as I claimed. Another asked why I would involve a doctor in a family joke. A third simply wrote that maybe the whole thing had gotten out of hand and everyone should calm down. I set the phone down slowly. Gaslighting always begins with a rewrite. Rowan walked into the kitchen carrying his block tower. "Mom, look what I made." I smiled and crouched beside him. "That's impressive." He hesitated, studying my face. "Something wrong?" "No." I smoothed his hair. "Just grown-up stuff." For a few days, the noise stayed mostly within the family. Then it spread. Lakewood Elementary had a parent messaging group where people shared reminders about field trips and soccer practice. I rarely paid attention to it unless Rowan had a school event. 3 days after Christmas, I opened the app and saw a message thread with dozens of replies. Someone had asked a simple question about accessibility seating at the winter concert. Then Paula Jennings had responded. Paula was 39, one of those parents who always volunteered for everything and somehow managed to know everyone's business. Her message was short. Some kids don't actually need those accommodations. The replies came quickly. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." A few people asked for clarification. Paula responded again. Sometimes parents exaggerate medical issues to get special treatment. I didn't need her to say Rowan's name. Everyone reading that thread knew who she meant. My hands went cold. Across the table, Rowan was finishing his cereal. I closed the app before he could see the screen. But rumors move faster than you can close a phone. 2 days later, Rowan came home quieter than usual. He set his backpack down and sat at the kitchen table without taking off his coat. I waited a moment before asking, "How was school?" He stared at the table. "Fine." That answer was too short. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Rowan." He looked up slowly. "Do people think I'm pretending?" The question landed like a weight on the table between us. My instinct was to say no, to tell him no one thought that. But kids are good at hearing what adults try to hide. "Some people don't understand your condition," I said carefully. "That doesn't mean they're right." He nodded, but didn't look convinced. "One boy said if I can walk to the classroom, then I shouldn't use the chair." His voice was small but steady. I didn't know what to say to that without sounding angry. "You know your body better than anyone," I told him, "and the doctor knows your medical history. That's what matters. He picked at the sleeve of his sweater. I just don't want everyone talking about it. I reached across the table and took his hand. I know. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with the school. Lakewood Elementary sat 10 minutes from our house, a brick building surrounded by bare winter trees. I had been there dozens of times for conferences and school events, but that morning, the hallway felt different. The receptionist led me to the office of the assistant principal, Renee Carter. Renee Carter was in her early 40s, calm and professional in the way school administrators often are when they've spent years navigating worried parents. She greeted me with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming in, Miss Quinn." I placed a folder on her desk. Inside were copies of Rowan's medical records, letters from Dr. Celeste Rowan, and documentation of the accommodations recommended for his condition. Renee opened the folder and began reading carefully. A few minutes later, another person joined us, Daniel Ortiz, Rowan's fourth-grade teacher. Daniel was the kind of teacher every kid hopes to get at least once in school, patient, observant, and quietly protective of the students who needed it. He sat beside Renee and nodded toward me. "Rowan's one of the hardest working kids in my class," he said. He hesitated before continuing. "There have been a few days when he's had to sit down suddenly during activities. He always tries to push through it." I felt a wave of gratitude I didn't expect. Renee closed the folder. "We want Rowan to feel safe at school," she said. "That includes using his wheelchair when he needs it." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm aware there have been some conversations among parents." The polite phrase didn't hide the truth. Rumors had reached the school. Renee leaned back slightly. "Based on the medical documentation and Dr. Rowan's recommendations, Rowan is fully entitled to the accommodations he's been using." She folded her hands on the desk. "If anyone questions that, they can speak to us directly." The meeting ended with a formal note added to Rowan's file confirming his access to mobility support during school activities. It should have felt like a victory, but as I walked back to my car, I kept thinking about how quickly a story can change once someone decides to twist it. And no one twisted stories better than my sister. A few days later, I ran into Marina outside a grocery store near my parents' neighborhood. She was standing beside a silver SUV, talking loudly on the phone about a property showing. When she saw me, she ended the call and smiled the way people smile when they're already preparing their next sentence. "So the school's involved now?" Her tone was casual but sharp. "I'm making sure Rowan has what he needs." She leaned against the condor. "You always liked making things complicated." I studied her for a moment. There were small signs I hadn't noticed before. The tension in her shoulders, the way she checked her phone every second. Real estate had slowed down that winter. The market was cooling, and Marina's income depended entirely on sales. "Doing okay with work?" I asked. She shrugged. "The market's weird right now." Then she added quickly, "But things will pick up." Her eyes flicked away for a second. It was the first time I wondered if her anger had less to do with Rowan and more to do with everything else in her life that wasn't going the way she expected. Marina had always assumed certain things about the future, especially when it came to family money. Her grandfather, Howard Quinn, had built a successful manufacturing business decades earlier. Even after selling it, he remained comfortably wealthy. In Marina's mind, that money had always been waiting somewhere in the background. And in Marina's mind, I was competition. That realization settled into place slowly over the next few days. Then, one evening, my phone rang while Rowan was finishing homework at the kitchen table. The caller ID displayed one name, Howard Quinn. I stepped into the hallway before answering. "Hello?" His voice came through steady and quiet. "Ilara?" "Yes?" There was a pause. Then he spoke again. "I saw everything that happened that night." The words hung in the air between us as the house around me stayed perfectly still.
If this story touched you, please subscribe and let someone out there feel less alone. Thank you.
Chapter 5. The Decision. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The hallway light hummed softly above me while Rowan's pencil scratched across paper in the kitchen. The sound was so ordinary, it made the conversation on the phone feel even heavier. Grandfather Howard spoke again before I could respond. I called Marina earlier today. That didn't surprise me. What did she say? There was a quiet pause. The same thing she's been telling everyone else. I leaned my shoulder against the wall. That Rowan is pretending? Yes. His voice stayed calm, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger exactly, something firmer. I asked her if she believed that. And she said she had eyes. I closed my eyes for a second. That sounded exactly like Marina. Howard continued slowly. Then I asked Noah what happened. My heart skipped a beat. What did he say? He said his mother told him Rowan didn't need the chair. The words were spoken plainly, without accusation, but they landed harder than anything Marina had said publicly. I rubbed my temple. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. Another pause. Then Howard spoke again, quieter this time. I watched a child reach for his wheelchair and find nothing. The sentence hung between us. I've lived 84 years, he continued. I've seen plenty of family arguments. That wasn't an argument. What was it? A test. I frowned slightly. A test? Yes. He let the word settle. And your sister failed it. The air in the hallway felt colder. I didn't know what to say. Howard broke the silence. I'm meeting with my attorney tomorrow. That caught my attention. Why? You'll understand soon enough. Before I could ask anything else, he spoke again. Be available next Thursday morning. For what? You'll see. The call ended a few seconds later. I stood there holding the phone for a while before walking back into the kitchen. Rowan looked up from his homework. Was that Grandpa? Yeah. He smiled faintly. He likes the spaceship drawing I sent him. I'm sure he does. I didn't mention anything about the conversation. Some things children shouldn't have to carry. A week later, I drove downtown to Columbus with Rowan in the passenger seat beside me. Victor Harlan's law office was on the 7th floor of an older brick building overlooking High Street. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. When we stepped into the waiting area, I saw the rest of the family already there. Marina sat in one of the leather chairs, scrolling through her phone with exaggerated boredom. My mother, Darlene Vale, sat beside her, holding her purse tightly in both hands. My father stood near the window, staring down at the street. Marina looked up when we walked in. Well, look who showed up. Her voice had that familiar edge. What's this about, Alara? I have no idea. She smirked. Right. Rowan stayed close to me, quietly observing the room. A moment later, the door to the conference room opened and a tall man stepped out. Victor Harlan. He looked exactly like someone who had spent decades reading complicated documents for a living. Thank you all for coming, he said calmly. Mr. Quinn is ready to see you. We followed him into the conference room. Grandfather Howard sat at the far end of the long table, hands folded in front of him. The moment Rowan saw him, he brightened slightly. Hi, Grandpa. Howard smiled. Hi, kiddo. Victor closed the door behind us and took a seat beside him. Marina leaned back in her chair immediately. So, what's the emergency family meeting? Victor opened a folder. Mr. Quinn has asked me to review an update to his estate plan. Marina's eyes lit up just slightly. That was the first time I realized what she thought this meeting was about. Inheritance. Victor continued. As part of the update, Mr. Quinn has decided to establish a trust fund for Rowan Quinn. I felt Rowan shift beside me. What's a trust? He whispered quietly. Something that helps take care of you, I murmured back. Marina gave a small laugh. That's sweet. Her tone was casual. So, how is everything else being divided? Victor didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward Howard. My grandfather straightened slightly in his chair. I'll explain the rest myself. The room went quiet. Marina crossed one leg over the other. Go ahead. Howard looked directly at her. You will not be receiving any portion of my estate. The sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Marina laughed. Oh, come on. Howard didn't smile. I'm serious. Her expression hardened. You're cutting me out? Yes. My mother gasped softly. Howard, maybe we should talk about this later. He shook his head. No. Marina leaned forward. Because of that stupid dinner? Howard's voice stayed calm because of what happened at that dinner. His eyes shifted briefly toward Rowan, then back to Marina. I watched a 9-year-old child reach for his wheelchair and find nothing. The room felt smaller. I watched a room full of adults do nothing. No one interrupted him. Marina's face flushed. It was a joke. The same defense again. Howard's expression didn't change. Humiliating a child is not a joke. Victor slid a document across the table toward Marina. Mr. Quinn's decision has been finalized. She stared down at the papers. You can't be serious. I am. Her voice rose. You're choosing her over your own family. Howard spoke slowly. I am choosing the child who was treated like a spectacle. Marina pushed her chair back abruptly. This is unbelievable. She looked at me like the entire situation was somehow my fault. You turned him against me. I shook my head. You did that yourself. For a moment, no one spoke. My father rubbed his forehead. My mother looked like she might cry. Rowan stayed very still beside me. Finally, Marina grabbed her purse and stood up. Fine. Her voice shook with anger. Keep your money. She walked toward the door, heels striking sharply against the floor. Just before leaving, she turned back toward the table. You'll regret this. Howard didn't respond. The door slammed behind her. The room stayed silent for several seconds after she was gone. Howard leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time that morning, he looked tired. Rowan reached across the table and gently touched his hand. You didn't have to do that. Howard smiled softly. Yes, I did. He squeezed Rowan's hand once. Then he looked at me. And in that moment, I understood that the real decision had been made long before we walked into that room. Chapter 6. 1 year later. The room stayed quiet long after Marina slammed the door. No one rushed to fill the silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles in after something final has been said, when everyone understands there is no way to pull the words back. Rowan still had his small hand resting over my grandfather's. Howard squeezed it once more before letting go. You're a good kid, he said softly. Rowan looked embarrassed in the way children do when adults praise them in a serious room. Thank you. Victor Harlan cleared his throat gently, gathering the papers on the table. There are a few formal documents we will finalize today, he said. His tone returned the room to something practical, something easier to handle than emotions. But even while he spoke, I could see the weight of the moment settling over everyone. My mother looked shaken. My father avoided eye contact with anyone. And my grandfather simply sat there calmly, as if the most difficult part had already happened. When the meeting ended, Rowan and I walked out of the building into the cold Columbus air. Snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes drifting across High Street. Rowan tugged lightly on my sleeve. Mom. Yeah. Why was Aunt Marina so mad? I thought about how to answer that without placing the burden of adult conflict on a 9-year-old. Sometimes grown-ups don't like being told they were wrong. He nodded thoughtfully, like he understood more than I expected. Then he said something that surprised me. Grandpa wasn't wrong. I smiled faintly. No, he wasn't. Life didn't change overnight after that meeting. For a while, everything felt strangely quiet. Marina stopped calling. Family gatherings became smaller. Some relatives chose to stay neutral, others simply drifted away from the conflict altogether. But Rowan didn't seem to miss the noise. If anything, the calm helped him. Without the constant pressure of proving himself, he started listening to his body more carefully. Some mornings he still needed the wheelchair. Other days he surprised both of us by walking farther than usual. Dr. Celeste Rowan adjusted his therapy schedule and introduced a new physical therapy program designed to strengthen his circulation and balance. Twice a week, Rowan and I drove to the clinic where a therapist guided him through slow exercises. At first, the progress was small, standing a few minutes longer, walking across the room without getting dizzy, climbing 3 steps instead of 2. Each improvement felt like its own quiet victory. One afternoon, almost 6 months later, Rowan managed to walk across the entire therapy room without stopping. He turned toward me with a grin that filled his entire face. "Did you see that?" I saw. He held his arms out dramatically, like he had just crossed a finish line. "I didn't fall." The therapist laughed. "That's the goal." But the biggest change wasn't physical, it was emotional. Rowan no longer watched every adult in the room to see if they believed him. He no longer tried to hide his wheelchair from other kids. He simply used what he needed, and when he didn't need it, he left it behind. My grandfather visited often during that year. Howard Quinn had slowed down a lot, but Rowan's presence seemed to give him energy. They would sit on the back porch together talking about baseball or drawing plans for imaginary rocket ships. One evening, Rowan asked him a question I hadn't expected. "Grandpa." "Yeah? Why did you do that thing with the lawyer?" Howard thought about the question for a moment. "Because sometimes adults forget what kindness looks like." Rowan tilted his head. "And you didn't forget?" Howard smiled. "I try not to." That winter passed quietly. Then, early the following spring, my phone rang late one evening. It was my father. His voice sounded older than I remembered. "Alara?" "Yes?" He paused before saying the next words. "Your grandfather passed away this afternoon." For a moment, the room around me seemed to fade. I sat down slowly on the couch. "Was he in pain?" "No." My father's voice softened. "It was peaceful." The funeral was small, just a handful of family members and a few old friends who had known Howard for decades. Rowan stood beside me the entire time, holding my hand. When the service ended, he looked up at me quietly. "Grandpa believed me." "Yes." "And he helped me." "He did." Rowan nodded once, satisfied with the answer. Several months later, the legal paperwork Victor Harlan had prepared was finalized. Howard's trust for Rowan officially took effect. The total amount was just over $540,000, more than enough to cover specialized medical care, therapy, and future education if Rowan chose to pursue it. But the money itself never felt like the real inheritance. The real gift was the freedom it gave Rowan. Freedom from arguing with insurance companies about therapy sessions, freedom from worrying about equipment costs, freedom from the kind of stress that quietly follows families dealing with long-term medical conditions. And maybe most importantly, freedom from people who demanded proof before offering compassion. A year after that Christmas dinner, Rowan and I walked through the small park near our house one warm afternoon. The grass was still damp from melted snow. Rowan walked ahead of me along the path. No wheelchair, no hesitation, just careful, steady steps. Halfway across the park, he stopped and turned around. "Mom?" "Yeah?" He lifted his arms like a tiny victory celebration. "I made it all the way over here." I laughed and walked toward him. "You did." He grinned. "Grandpa would think that's pretty cool." I looked across the park for a moment before answering. "I think he already knows." That night, after Rowan fell asleep, I sat quietly in the living room thinking about everything that had happened. Families are complicated. Sometimes the people you share blood with are the ones who hurt you the most. And sometimes the person who stands up for you when it's hardest becomes the definition of family. My grandfather understood something simple that a lot of adults forget. Respecting a child's dignity should never be optional. Rowan never had to prove his illness to him. He was believed, and that belief changed everything. But I still think about that night sometimes, about the moment I stood in my parents' dining room holding my phone while my son reached for a wheelchair that wasn't there. And I wonder what other people would have done in that situation. If you were standing there watching someone treat your child that way, would you have walked away from family to protect them? And do you think my grandfather made the right decision when he changed his will after what he saw? I'd really like to know what you think.